All right. Okay. This is April 15th, 2011. My name is Joe Bruckner. I'm a volunteer at the Atlanta History Center, and I'm here today with Tony Hilliard, who is also a volunteer at the Atlanta History Center, and we're honored to have Sabin Gianelloni with us today. Sabin is a Vietnam veteran and has kindly agreed to come in here and tell us his story in connection with the Library of Congress Veterans History Project. We really appreciate you coming in today, and we're looking forward to hearing your experiences, and it's an honor for us to be here with you.
It's indeed a pleasure to be here.
Would you please give us your full name and your current address?
Yes, my name is Sabin Joseph Gianelloni III in Sandy Springs, which is a northern suburb of Fulton County, Georgia.
And where were you born, and what is your date of birth?
I was born in Baton Rouge, Louisiana on January the 7th, 1937.
Tell us a little bit about your upbringing.
I was born in Baton Rouge, but I was never a town boy. I grew up on a sugarcane plantation just south of the town on the River Road, a rather historical place owned by my father, my grandfather, and great-grandfather. It was a country life that I led. I went to school in the local Catholic schools in town. In the 8th grade, I went away to Gulf Coast Military Academy in Gulfport, Mississippi, which happened to be its last year. It closed up at the end of that academic year. Following that, I came here to Georgia and did all of my high school at Riverside Military Academy in Gainesville, Georgia.
Had you had family members in the military?
Never in the regular Army. At this period in time, there's been approximately 18 men with my family name who served in the armed forces. The first man was a cousin who served in the Spanish-American War.
Wow. When did you join the military?
I graduated from college from the Citadel in 1960, and at that time I accepted a commission in the regular Army with the expectation that I would serve only the 3 years that was the obligation and return to civilian life. However, it didn't work out that way. I ended up staying in the Army 20 and a half years.
Well, congratulations.
Yes.
Tell us about your training when you first went in the service, where you were and what you were trained to do.
I was commissioned in the Armor Branch, and of course went to Fort Knox for basic officer training. Following that, I did the extra things, the infantry things, Airborne School, Ranger School, and was then assigned to the 4th Armored Division in Germany. And from Germany, I went back to Fort Knox to the advanced school, and from that I was assigned to be an instructor at the infantry school. The infantry school kept me for 2 years, and at that point my ticket got punched to go to Vietnam. I was selected to go to language school because I have a good aptitude for languages, so I went to Fort Bliss, Texas for Vietnamese language. It was a 3-month course, very intensive, and I actually spoke the language. And from there, I went to Vietnam, and I knew what my assignment was. I was assigned to be an advisor in a Vietnamese cavalry regiment. It ended up being the 9th Cavalry Regiment in the Mekong Delta, attached to the 21st Infantry Division. All of those, of course, Vietnamese units, not American.
How did your family feel and your friends about you going to Vietnam?
There was no negative response from anybody about it. My father was, in fact, a private in World War I. And my uncles were, one of my uncles was a World War I veteran, and several cousins were in World War II, so the experience of military service was there in the family, and there was no negative feedback to me about it.
Based on your training and just people you had talked to who had been there, did you have a pretty good idea of what you were going to face when you got in country?
Not exactly. I didn't have any training that said this is specifically how you act in Vietnam, other than the language. I had voluntarily gone to the Jungle Warfare School in 1965 when I was an instructor at the infantry school. I did that because I wanted to find out or feel more closer to the infantry officers that whom I was instructing. But it was not really Vietnam training, because where I went there were no real jungles.
Yeah. What was your first impression of the country when you landed?
The first week, or more, actually something like 10 days, was all orientation in Saigon at the MACV compound. My first real impression of the country was when I landed in Bac Lieu, which is in the far south. And I stepped out of this Caribou airplane and I said, my gosh, I'm back in Louisiana. It was flat, a lot of water, very hot.
Now, when was this? What year did you go?
November of 1967.
Okay.
And then I, became essentially a member of the Vietnamese Army.
Okay. Yeah. Tell us about your tour in Vietnam, your experiences, what you did and what you saw and how it affected you.
Well, I spent all the time with the Vietnamese. I was subordinate to a Vietnamese lieutenant colonel who was the regimental commander. The Vietnamese inherited the French system, and what they called a regiment was in fact a squadron. But that's just the way they did it. I had no command authority. The only thing I really controlled was American assets. I was a manager of acquiring aviation support of all types, sometimes ground transportation, and field artillery support. We actually had one U.S. field artillery battalion in Delta. And of course, I advised, but I would say I probably made suggestions because I had no command authority.
Were you on an advisory team?
Yes.
A MACV advisory team?
Yes, we had an advisory team for the regiment,
Okay.
but we were split up in the small groups. I had myself and a couple of sergeants at the headquarters, and in each troop had three men, one officer and two sergeants. So we were a very small group.
Okay.
I was never in an operation where there were more than 7 or maybe 8 a couple of times Americans, and there would be 300 or 400 Vietnamese.
And I know the advisory teams at some point had numbers, like advisory team number.
Yes,
Ted,
we
was
had
yours?
a number. And my number, actually the division advisory team, of which I was technically a member, was advisory team 51.
Okay. Talk about your experiences while you were there and your activities and some of the more significant, in your mind, events that you were part of. And what you did on a day-to-day basis.
My day-to-day basis was being with them, and wherever the colonel went, I was basically a shadow. I mean, I just followed him. And we went on the operations. I slept with them, I ate with them, I ate their food primarily. I would stay in an American compound when I had the chance, but that didn't happen that many times. It was always a pleasure to get back to little American food and things. One of my rewards for being an associate of the Vietnamese Army was I acquired amoebic dysentery about the 6th week that I was there. Very, very sick. But I was lucky. I got through it in about 3 days. I saw other people that were down for a couple of weeks, just in awful condition.
How frequently did you make contact with the enemy?
We made contact, I would probably say, in 30 days, and we didn't actually operate 30 days in a row. but maybe in a given month, we would make contact 4 or 5 times. Sometimes very fleeting. Sometimes they would hang on, for an hour, 2 hours. I never fought the NVA. We fought only the Viet Cong, because that's the only guys that were there. There were 2 battalions in the Delta that were referred to as regular Viet Cong. If you made contact with them, which we did, you could tell it in the first few minutes, because they were just different the way they responded. They had greater discipline, and fire discipline was good, and they would hang on. We had a great advantage because our primary weapon was a 50 caliber machine gun. Every armored personnel carrier had one, and of course we had lots of other handheld weapons.
What was your relationship with the Vietnamese soldier, the Vietnamese officer? You obviously spent a lot of time with them, and did it become a friendship or a professional relationship or a little bit of both? Or?
Probably a little bit of both. I was fairly close to the commander and the officers. We all knew each other quite well. The soldiers, I was not, really close to them. I had one Vietnamese soldier who was essentially my orderly and jeep driver, and of course he would come with me every day, and we were sort of friends. Anytime I asked for something of a soldier, or it wasn't done as if I was giving him a command. I had to sort of make it like, would you mind doing this for me? And they did. I was never refused. But that's the way you played that game.
Did you have any contact with the Vietnamese civilians at any point?
Oh yes, lots. And I think that was probably one of the most rewarding experiences, was being able to intermingle and get to know people. Because we went into little villages and stayed there. We escorted U.S. medical personnel and brought them into villages and in rural areas to give medical and dental aid to just plain civilians at random. And it would be announced that the American medics were coming, and the people would just line up to get help. One of the unfortunate things of the war was the American units were basically isolated from the people, and they just didn't know what the Vietnamese were doing. And that was a major failing of the war, in my opinion.
So you were, over and above conducting military operations, you were helping the local populace?
Oh yes, yeah, we did everything from, I recall that those were called med caps, and we slept with them. We stayed in the towns. We protected them. I actually slept in a Vietnamese house a number of times. And the typical American soldier has never had that experience, and never sat at a table and ate a meal with a total stranger. It was different.
Good. Well, I know you're not going to mention this, so I'm going to ask you about it. I noticed you were awarded the Silver Star. Would you talk about that?
Well, that's actually a mistake. I do not have the Silver Star.
Oh.
No.
Well,
No. I have the Vietnamese Cross of Gallantry 3 times. Palm, Silver Star, and Bronze Star. The highest American decoration I got was the Bronze Star.
Okay.
Yeah.
Talk about that. What? I don't know if you have your certificate, but what was your award of the Bronze Star based on?
Actions in primarily the TET Offensive. I was actually recommended for the Silver Star, but a gentleman named Creighton Abrams had just come in and taken over command of MACV, and he was a bit startled at the number of Silver Stars being awarded, and he changed some policies. And speaking of that subject, in the year that I was in the Mekong Delta, I am aware of 3 people being awarded the Silver Star, one of which was a Vietnamese full colonel who definitely earned it in the TET Offensive. Wow. The other 2 were 2 American American captain's advisors. And that's what happened in 1 year down there that I'm aware of.
Wow. You mentioned TET. Were you in country during TET of '68?
Oh, yes, it was, yes.
Tell us about that, please.
Well, it was an interesting experience. We were primarily in the city of Canto, which is a major commercial city on the Bassac River, which the Bassac parallels the Mekong. And that's when it started. The VC had come in, had infiltrated into the town for several days before TET. And they had arms caches already pre-positioned, and so when the command came to attack, they were there. They didn't fight into town, they were there already. And they picked up their weapons, and they essentially controlled the town and several others throughout the Delta for anywhere from 1 to 3 days. And we had to chase them out of town. And we being not just the cavalry regiment, but a lot of infantry as well. The interesting thing is that they hit every provincial capital in the Delta with one exception, and that was Viton. And Viton was the name of the city and the province, and it had been created out of portions of 2 or 3 other provinces. This was after the French administration had left. And because it was something that was done after the French had drawn the maps, they ignored it. It was the only town that was not attacked. Yes, it's a strange story, but that's the way they did it.
Tell us a little bit about those 2 or 3 days during TET where they were actually in the city. How did you get them out?
They actually essentially ran out of ammunition and food. They had expected the capture of the town to be quick and that they would get immediate help from the people. There would be a general uprising. Well, that didn't happen. They did in fact fight their way out of town, but they lost. They suffered terrific casualties. In fact, we caught them crossing a road, and we really didn't know what we were getting into. We arrived as they were crossing this road, and we lined up half a dozen APCs, and they suffered dearly. And they were out within the 3rd day, the end of the 3rd day, and they never came back.
So after that period, did the activity decrease because of the damage done to the VC, or did it stay about the same?
Yes, it decreased, but they came back later. The 9th Cavalry, something like February the 6th or 7th, roughly a week after the TET offensive had died down, we were ordered to go to Kenyang province, which is on the Gulf of Siam. It has a coastline and a common boundary with Cambodia. And what was happening was there was a supply line coming out of Cambodia from communist China. And there was a supply route going across the Mekong Delta through Kenyang province to a very dense area known as the U Min Forest. And that was on the far eastern side of the peninsula. It was a sacrosanct place for the VC. The ARVN and the Vietnamese government would not go in there. We tried to get them to go in there. We got on the fringes of it, in fact. I have a story about that.
What was the name of it again?
U Min.
M-I-N-H?
The letter U, M-I-N-H. And it was very dense forest. So it wasn't a jungle. It wasn't like, the rainforest in Panama where I went, to go that train. But anyway, we finally made up a plan. We had good intelligence, extremely good intelligence, and we essentially went from across Kenyang province all the way to the Cambodian border. And we intercepted this supply train several times. And they did things in cells. Cell A would deliver the equipment at nighttime to a predetermined point. Usually they would hide it. It was either buried or sunk in canals. The weapons were all wrapped up in, with grease and so forth, and it would sink the boats. It wouldn't damage the boats. It just put water in them and let them go underwater. Then the next group would raise them and keep them moving, or they would be transferred, and there was no waterway. They would transfer them to carts and drags, and the VC farmers would drag them with ox. From the air, you could actually see the trail. It was unbelievable. We intercepted it, and I cannot really quote the exact number, but I'm going to guess that we probably captured 500 individual weapons, mortars, machine guns, 12.7 millimeter anti-aircraft weapons, and just so we had so much stuff that we couldn't carry it. We had to bring in Chinooks and Hueys to load the stuff up and carry it out.
Jeez.
Yeah, interesting. And but the VC were determined little fellas, and they were very clever. They were very clever. And this stuff was moving all the way across the peninsula to the Human Forest. And the weapons, I have pictures of the weapons with Chinese markings on them.
Really?
So there was no question about where the origin was.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, how was the morale of the Vietnamese soldier typically when you were there?
The cavalry units had a much higher morale than the infantry. The infantry outfits were in more heavier contact than we were. They lived a tough life. They once they got off an American helicopter, they had to start walking in the rainy season in water and mud and so forth. And of course, we got in the mud too, but we traveled heavy. We had comfort things. We were able to prepare hot meals. We had cots we could put out. I never slept on the ground. I had an old GI canvas folding cot, and my home was right next to the armored personnel carrier. So, but that was good. That was not bad.
Yeah.
in a relative sense.
Yeah.
We had morale problems when we got separated from the families. In fact, I have an interesting story, which is rather funny. We were in Kenyang province, the capital being Rakia, R-A-C-H and then G-I-A. Beautiful little coastal city with a fishing fleet and so forth. One of the nicer places in the Mekong Delta. Well, our real base was across the peninsula in the Bac Lu area, and that's where most of the families were. The Vietnamese Army traveled with the dependents, and when they got separated from them, they would start deserting. They'd go back to the family.
Yeah.
Something that the American Army was just couldn't deal with ever.
Yeah.
I mean, that and of course the American unit people never saw anything like that. But one day the regimental commander comes to me and he explains this problem in rather details, and he says, I need to get a Chinook, and we need to go back to make several trips back to Bac Lu and pick up the dependents. I said, yes, sir, I agree with that, because every day there was another couple of guys leaving.
Yeah.
So I spent an entire day from sunrise to sunset going back and forth across the peninsula in a Chinook, transporting women, children, chickens, pigs, goats, various cooking paraphernalia and little household items and so forth. And between the children and the animals, this helicopter was an absolute mess at the end of the day. And when I went to tell the crew chief thank you and so forth and so on, he looked at me like I was the enemy, and he says, Major, I don't want to ever see you again. And I understood, because the airplane was an absolute mess.
Well, did the rate of absenteeism
Oh, it
go
stopped.
down then?
It basically stopped, yes, yes, yes. And in fact, it was after that that we geared up this operation and went out for about 2.5 weeks and intercepted that supply line I talked about. But we probably could have done it without getting the guys there, but it wasn't going to be right.
Yeah.
Because we were basically out by ourselves, and if a larger force had jumped on us, we'd have had a hard time.
Yeah. Describe the difference you saw between the time you joined the unit and left the unit, and just in their efficiency and the overall situation. Did you see much difference? Did it get better, get worse? Or?
I don't think it made any big changes. There was a rotation of people. We had some casualties, but it was basically the same group. Some of the junior officers got out of the Army. They were able to get out, even though the country was in the midst of a war for survival.
Yeah. They
still had reserve officers that were released after a certain period of time. And the colonel and the operations officer and all 3 troop commanders, they were all regular Army. And they spoke French. And all of them except the operations officer spoke French, but he had not come up in the French system. My colonel and these old captains, they had actually been in the French colonial army.
Huh.
In fact, one of the captains was a Cambodian. His name was Keo, K-E-O, and obviously Cambodian, very tall, very dark, as opposed to the Vietnamese that were a lighter color and very short.
Yeah.
And the Vietnamese didn't particularly like the Cambodians. And Captain Keo sometimes had a hard time, getting people to follow his orders. I mean, there was never any mutiny or anything like
Yeah.
that, but some of them resented being subordinated to a Cambodian.
Were you able to keep up with any of your counterparts once you got back to the States? Your Vietnamese
I have
counterparts?
no idea where any of them are, whether any of them are living. It was just a complete break.
Yeah.
In fact, of the 7 or 8 Americans, counting officers and enlisted, that were with the regiment, I only saw one of them in person a few years later in the Pentagon, one of the officers. And I talked to one of the captains who was a reserve officer and got caught in the reduction in force. I talked to him on the phone one time, and that's it. No contact whatsoever. The advisors just don't have reunions. At least I'm not aware of anything, because it was just totally different.
Yeah.
Totally different.
So when did you leave Vietnam?
I left during the first week of November. I was there a full year. I might have, I can't recall exactly, but I might have departed 2 days before the official return date. That was another thing that was a bit of a mistake in Vietnam. The day you arrived, you were told the day that you're going to leave. So the sense of commitment was weakened, in my opinion. And of course, as you got closer to that date, you begin to be cautious, more cautious.
Yeah.
I don't recall exactly how cautious I was getting, but I'm sure I was. In fact, another interesting thing, I was close to, about 2 weeks before I was going to depart. And I was actually at that point doing some operations officer stuff with the division, more than being involved with the cavalry. And but the cavalry was involved. we had a large operation where we had a couple of infantry regiments, the cavalry, an American field artillery unit firing in support, Vietnamese field artillery firing, U.S. tactical air, and Vietnamese Air Force tactical air. Lots of stuff going on. The end story is I'm in a Huey command and control helicopter, and I see one of our Army bird dogs flying, and I see coming almost at a right angle to him, Vietnamese Air Force forward air controller. And you can see that they're going to collide. And the door of the Huey, of course, is open. I'm looking out of this big picture window, and in your mind it becomes slow motion. And you say, somebody's going to turn, obviously. This isn't going to happen. Well, it did. And the Vietnamese plane hit the fuselage behind the cockpit of the Army, U.S. Army plane. They stuck together and they dropped like a rock. This was about 1,200 feet or something, maybe 15 at the max, and just into the rice paddies. And it was, that time it was a rainy season, it was lots of water. Of course, they were both killed. It was probably the most horrible experience I had, even though I wasn't involved. I wasn't in any real danger, you know, that I was aware of. I went back, and I was, at that time, I was reporting to an American full colonel. And I went to him and I said, Colonel, I've got 12 days or something like that left. And I said, I cannot fly a helicopter anymore. I am not going up. He didn't like it. He didn't want to go up to command and control, so he gave it to me to do. He was a special forces officer and not a real, you know, big operations infantry officer. He was absolutely, he was really one of the pioneers in the special forces. He didn't like this getting involved with lots of different things going on. And anyway, I basically told him, I said, just don't order me to fly any more of that. I says, I don't think I'll do a good job of it. And he didn't make me do it.
Good.
I didn't tell him I wouldn't do it. I just said, I don't want to do that anymore. So you do get cautious, you know, I guess. Yeah.
Were you involved in the liberation of a POW?
Well, I was involved in the sense that I was eventually informed of it, and we did a failed attempt to get him. The individual was Major Nick Rowe, R-O-W-E. He was a West Point graduate class of '60, and he got into the Special Forces '62 or something like that. He was actually a field artillery officer and was one of the very early advisors in the Mekong Delta. And he was captured in '63 along with another officer down at, and the other guy, he died in captivity. Rowe was a prisoner for 5 years. We went on a couple of operations, we being a larger group, not just the cavalry regiment, but lots of infantry and us. We had very highly classified intelligence, most of it coming from satellite pictures, a little human intelligence, you know, about paying off Vietnamese and would-be Viet Cong to tell us what was going on. I was never directly involved in that. And we actually found a campsite. It was over near the U-Men Forest. Not in the U-Men Forest, but on the fringes of it. And we calculated that they had left maybe 2 or 3 hours when we got there, because it was just, that was the science, you know. Interesting how Nick Rowe escaped. I left in November. He escaped a couple of weeks later in December. And he had become fluent in the language, of course. And he had the same two guards the entire 5 years, and they became sort of a friendly group, you know.
Yeah.
You know. And the guards trusted him a little bit too much. And he went through this masquerade of fishing. And well, first he heard a helicopter, you know, off in the distance, and that's when he began to masquerade that he was fishing and started moving, you know, away toward a clearing where he could get out of this growth area and get into a clearing. That succeeded, and he ran out into the clearing. There's a very large open area. And of course, he had been with the Vietnamese for 5 years. He was wearing Vietnamese clothes. He looked like a VC. And he had facial, you know, some facial hair. So he goes out in the clearing, and this was at what was called the free fire zone. Anything that moved, you could shoot it. You know, the U.S. or Vietnamese forces, civilian or otherwise.
Yeah.
So he knew the helicopter makes a pass, and then the helicopter's coming back around, and they're going to engage him. They're going to kill him. He knows, he figures this out. He takes all of his clothes off, and he stands up and puts his arms up in the air to demonstrate clearly that he's white, that he's not, you know, an Oriental of any description. So that they were hoping that they'll recognize this and not shoot him. Well, they picked up on it, and they landed and they picked him up before the guards could react. And one of the guys, one of the pilots was one of his classmates, and I cannot recall the man's name. Nick Rowe wrote a book called 5 Years to Freedom, which tells that entire story in length. Nick eventually got out of the Army, went back to Texas, which was his origins. Something like 72 or 73, the Army asked him to come back on active duty in the rank of full colonel. And he had left in the rank of lieutenant colonel, I can't remember. But not to be in the Army, but to go to the Philippines and be a civilian clothed advisor to the Philippine Army on anti-insurgent, counterinsurgent operations.
Gosh.
He made the classic mistake that he knew he shouldn't be doing. He used the same route to go from his quarters to his office through the streets of Manila every day. The insurgents picked up on it. They ambushed him in the streets and killed him,
Oh my God.
along with a few other people that were in the vehicle. It's a sad story.
That is a sad story.
And I actually got to meet Nick Rowe in January of 1969, because I went from Vietnam to the faculty at West Point. And he had been out of captivity for 6, 7 weeks, something like that, and he was making a big tour of the country, and of course West Point was one of the prime locations, and he came to make a talk, to give a presentation to the cadets. And that's the first time I met him, and we talked, and he came to my office, and I still had this aviation scale map that I carried with me all the time, and I had markings on it where we were looking for him. And I said, we were here. And he says, you almost got us over here. You know, if you'd have gone another kilometer or two, or whatever it was, you know, over there, you might have gotten me.
That must have been an amazing experience for you to sit down there with him.
Yeah.
Boy.
Yeah.
Talk about your return to the States and what you felt when you got back, what the reaction of either the public, your family, your friends was when you got back.
Well, when I got back, I reported to my father, and he's one of his comments to me, he says, you're uptight. He says, you're nervous as a cat. And I said, well, I probably am, but I wasn't quite aware of it, but he could see it. And it took me a while to calm down, so to speak. And it was, you know, the humdrum of domestic chores and the importance that wives put on things around the house meant nothing to me.
Yeah.
You know, they said, you know, this is trivia. why should I get involved in worrying about the washing machine doesn't sound right? You know,
Yeah.
I don't care.
Yeah, yeah,
And you had to gravitate slowly back into those things that were once important.
yeah. That's,
And of course, I went to a community that was gung ho and fully, supportive. I went to West Point.
right, yeah.
So that was actually an escape from reality.
Yeah.
Because once you went inside the Thayer Gate, you were in a self-supporting, totally empathetic community.
Yeah.
And outside, different. In fact, I went to New York City in uniform to meet my father, who was spending the night before traveling to Europe. And I really didn't have time to change into civilian clothes. So I go into New York City in uniform, and some strange looking guy, runs up and, starts screaming in my face, profanities, and in fact, it spit on me, and of course, there I am, an officer, and I'm obviously got West Point in the signature, and my instinct was to just pound this guy, but I couldn't.
Yeah.
I had to ignore it and just say, just go away and leave me alone.
Yeah.
Eventually he does, I mean, he never struck me or anything like that, or picked up something and threw it at me. He just made he just insulted me
Yeah.
to the far as he could go. But anyway,
Well, you showed a lot of restraint by not going after him.
well, I figured that a court martial or something was not
No.
was not worth it.
Yeah.
But anyway, interesting. That was really the only time I had a bad experience.
Would you describe what you did the rest of your career in the service, in the military, where just generally where you went, what your
Yeah.
assignments were?
Yeah. Well, I sort of got stuck in it, as a teacher, instructor. I did, the infantry school and then West Point, advisor, kind of all in the same ballpark. So when I left West Point, I said, it's time to get back into the real Army. So I went to Washington and talked to the senior officer there in the Armor Branch, and he said, well, I can send you, this was 71, he said, I got a place to send you in Vietnam. And I said, no, thank you, Colonel, I've been there and done that one. And I said, I want to go to the regular Army. I want to go to the most active outfit we got. And he says, that'll be the 1st Cavalry Division at Fort Hood, Texas. I said, sign me up. And it was an experimental unit. It was called the TRICAP, Triple Capability Division. And what we were doing is we were testing new concepts, tactical concepts, new equipment, and it was very interesting. And we were not structured like the typical, regular Army was. We made up things to do. It was just, let's do something that nobody's ever done. And if it didn't turn out to be very well, then we did something else. And of course we were supporting this very sophisticated group called MASTER, MASSTER, Modern Army Selected Systems Test Evaluation and Review, a nifty word, MASTER. Then my friends in the Pentagon called me up one day, and fellows I'd known at infantry school and at West Point, and he says, "Do you speak French?" I said, "Yes." I grew up in the French language, not fluently, but I knew it, and I studied it. In fact, in Vietnam, I spoke to my Vietnamese officers English, French, and Vietnamese.
And this is from your Louisiana background?
Yes, plus I studied it.
What you studied, okay.
So he says, "You're going to Cambodia." I said, "Well, what?" He said, "But," he says, "and you're going to be attached to the embassy with this outfit called Military Equipment Delivery Team." That was the military assistance program.
Yeah.
You wasn't going to. It was administrative. We were not going to go out in the bushes, I don't think, and fight with them. I wasn't going to get a second round of that, I don't think. So I go to Monterey, California to the real language school, which was a great assignment. And I studied French for 4 months. And then I come home and I'm waiting for my orders to go to Cambodia. Well, of course, the war ended. I was in language school when the treaty was signed in January of 1973. You know, and in March, the prisoners, you know, John McCain and his group were released. So I'm back home and yeah, beginning of February, and I'm waiting around for, I think I waited around for 3 weeks, so I finally called this fellow up and I said, what's going on? You know, I'm just sitting here. You know, I have no job. I'm being paid, but that's okay. He says, whoa, he says, because of the war has ended, you're not going. I said, well, thank you for telling me. So I said, I want to go to Europe. And I went to Europe, and I was assigned to Heidelberg, to headquarters U.S. Army Europe. As an operations officer, general staff. And I did 4 years there, and then I concluded that I had enough of the Army. I just needed to get past 20. So I came here to Fort McPherson, and I was there a year and a half. I didn't actually have to stay the last 6 months, but my boss asked me to.
Yeah.
Matter of fact, he was a Citadel graduate. And so I said, okay, 6 months is all you're gonna get.
Yeah.
You know. So I retired from the Army.
And when was that?
Officially retired on the 1st of February, 1981.
Okay.
And I stayed here.
Okay.
Yeah, I actually travel back to Louisiana very frequently because I managed the family property there. And I was in the sugarcane business until 2005.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, you've got an amazing story. I mean, really interesting
Oh, I could go on
experiences.
for ages, but I think I've probably given you too much already.
Well, no, you haven't. And before we finish, I want to give you a chance to relate any experiences you want to get on the record, or really say anything to people who will watch this.
I have a couple of opinions,
Okay.
which I'll conclude
Sure.
very quickly. I mentioned one of them basically was the U.S. Army units just being so separated from the people and not understanding the culture and making these assumptions that anybody that's not wearing a military uniform is bad.
Yeah.
That's how you get things like My Lai and this total cultural separation.
Yeah.
I think we had some leadership problems. The helicopter ruined particularly the infantry leadership concept of leading from the front. Field grade commanders flew around in circles in helicopters. They didn't get on the ground. Now, obviously, there are exceptions. You know,
Yeah.
the story of Hal Moore
Yeah.
and his outfit. That's totally different. But generally speaking, that was a big problem. My own experience, I never was ever outranked by an American officer on the ground. I was outranked by American officers flying around in helicopters,
Is that right?
but never on the ground.
And what was your rank at the time?
Major.
Well,
I never saw a senior field grade officer, you know, on the ground. I mean, participating in the operation. I had a two-star general land one day. We were out in the middle of Kenyang province, and of course that was a no contact. We were just out there. We were looking for somebody to fight. And the general lands and spends 10 minutes talking to me and flies away. I said, okay. And I think the other final thing that got ruined was the marksmanship in the infantry units, where everybody gets an automatic weapon, and you just fire away,
yeah.
full automatic all the time.
Yeah.
You don't know what you're shooting at. It's just volume of bullets.
Yeah.
I think, and the Army kind of gave up on marksmanship, as opposed to the Marine Corps, who still think that that's what you need to. You need to be able to hit a target,
Yeah.
a specific target, at a long range. So those are my three.
Well, those are interesting observations.
Sort of observations. And the other one was, this go home ticket the minute you arrive. You
Yeah.
If you don't get killed, you're gonna go home and this day are wounded and have to be evacuated.
Yeah. Tony, do you have any questions you'd like to ask? And is there anything else you'd like to say for the record?
Yeah, I want to tell one more story.
Okay.
It involves an American,
Sure.
and then I'll quit. We were operating south of Canton. This is with the cavalry. And we had a contact. It wasn't a ferocious battle, but it was, you know, you had to be careful. And I hear this sort of hysterical voice on the advisor tactical net. And this guy is very excited. He's saying, we've been ambushed, we've been ambushed. The major's been hit, and we got one, you know, he's in a panic situation. Somebody's killed, somebody's been wounded. And I said, where are you? And he says, I'm on the highway. I don't know where I am. I'm just on the highway. Well, it turns out this guy's a kilometer or so away from me. And I get in my vehicle and I tell my colonel, I said, I got to go see what's going on. I said, I got to have a vehicle. I couldn't take his. I normally rode with him on his. So I get one of the other headquarters vehicles and I go back. What had happened is this district advisor had gone into Canton, to the airport, to pick up a sergeant who had just come in country. And it was just the American officer and his Vietnamese driver, a Jeep. He picked the sergeant up. And they're coming down the road south of Canton, and they get ambushed by a little Viet Cong outfit that was not participating in the fight we were in. But they were probably tied to that operation. Yeah. Well, the Vietnamese soldier is dead, the sergeant is driving, and the officer has been shot through the knee, through his right knee. His knee is just all torn up. Well, his name is Robert Jackmeyer from Michigan. I know this guy for 20 minutes. Do first aid, call in the medevac, and off he goes. But I had his name. I call up the hospital some 2 weeks or so later and inquire about Major Jackmeyer, and said, "Oh, he's been evacuated. He's gone to Okinawa." I said, "Wonderful," you know. I write this story home, and I get a response, because remember, this was all written mail, not email. And the response was his wife had moved into the neighborhood. He was an infantry officer, and it was I still owned a house at Fort Benning, not at Fort Benning, but just outside in the town. And he died of a blood clot in the hospital.
Gee.
Yeah. And his name is on the wall, of course, and I've seen Robert Jackmeyer. Only Jackmeyer on the wall. Wow. That's the end of the stories.
Well, I can't tell you how much we appreciate you coming in and sharing these stories, and it's an honor to be here with you, because you sure served your country well, both in Vietnam and after Vietnam, and we really appreciate your service.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
Well, thank you.
Okay.